Every day, tens of thousands of airplanes cross the sky. Millions of people board flights, sip coffee, scroll their phones, and never once think about what could go wrong. And statistically, that makes sense. Aviation is one of the safest ways to travel. But why are so many people afraid to fly? And what has caused and will continue to cause disasters that are impossible to recall without tears? Today, we'll break down 10 of the most unbelievable air disasters in history. Some ended in miraculous rescues, while others claimed hundreds of lives. And stay until the end, because we'll cover the deadliest disaster in the history of civil aviation and the chain of mistakes behind it that is almost impossible to believe. Disaster 10. Boeing 737, January 1989. Let's start with a story that shows how a single mistake can cost dozens of lives. A British plane was en route from London to Belfast. 14 minutes into the flight, one of the engines failed. Severe vibration set in and controllability dropped sharply, but it wasn't critical. The plane has two engines, and one is often enough to reach the nearest airport. The problem was something else. The pilots couldn't determine exactly which engine had failed. The instrument readings weren't clear enough. After a brief discussion, the crew decided to shut down the right engine. Things got a little better. The vibration decreased. They began preparing for an emergency landing, but as the plane was already on approach, the left engine started losing power. The readings were dropping rapidly, and the systems reported a fire. They had seconds to make a decision. The crew did everything they could, but at a speed of 212 kilometers per hour, the aircraft slammed into an earth embankment next to a motorway. The plane broke apart into 3 sections. 47 passengers were killed. The rest of the 126 people on board were injured, but survived. The investigation revealed a horrifying truth. After detecting the malfunction, the pilots had shut down the working engine and continued flying on the one that was on fire. The most shocking part is that passengers and flight attendants could see which engine was actually ablaze. They were surprised that the crew was trying to fix the problem with the other engine, but the pilots couldn't see the fire from the cockpit and didn't even think to ask anyone in the cabin. After this disaster, a new rule was added to operating procedures. Crews are now required to communicate with passengers to verify information during emergency situations. The pilots were disciplined, but they saved most of the people on board by managing to land the plane on a single malfunctioning engine, which is an incredibly difficult task in itself. Disaster 9. Airbus A330, August 2001. Now, a story with an unexpected ending. An Air Transat plane was flying from Toronto to Lisbon with 300 people on board. In the 6th hour of the flight, the crew faced an unbelievable situation. Below them was the Atlantic Ocean, and they had run out of fuel. Completely. Not a single drop left. One of the pilots remembered that about 320 kilometers away in the Azores, there was a military airbase. That's where they headed. 217 kilometers from their destination, they had to shut down one engine. A few minutes later, the second one died too. This plane had no other engines. To keep the instruments and communications from going dead with the engines off, airplanes have an emergency power system, a small turbine that deploys outside and spins from the oncoming airflow. But that didn't solve the main problem. They still had to reach the runway with no thrust. The captain calculated the aircraft's glide ratio right there in flight, not just to make the airfield, but also to hold the speed needed for a safe landing. There could be no second attempt for obvious reasons. Despite all the calculations, the landing speed still slightly exceeded the safe limit. The plane overshot the runway by more than a kilometer, and nearly all of its tires burst. But out of the 306 people on board, no one was hurt. The pilots became national heroes and record holders. They kept a passenger aircraft airborne without engines for 120 kilometers. Ground technicians were found to be at fault. They made an error during the installation of the hydraulic system, which caused a fuel leak. If you've ever wondered what happens when a plane loses its engines, hit like. Because from here on out, the stories get even more intense and a lot more terrifying. Disaster 8. Boeing 737, April 1988. Imagine an ordinary local flight in the Hawaiian Islands. 89 passengers and 6 crew members were flying from the coastal town of Hilo to the capital, Honolulu. In the 23rd minute of the flight, at a speed of 500 kilometers per hour, a massive section of the passenger cabin's fuselage ripped away from the aircraft. It simply tore off and was carried up into the sky. Everyone inside the plane was suddenly exposed to an airstream with a temperature of minus 45 degrees, and this was Hawaii. People were dressed for summer. Some were even wearing swimsuits. The crew didn't lose their composure and immediately began descending for an emergency landing. The most terrifying part was that the instruments indicated a landing gear malfunction. If the landing gear didn't deploy, the landing would turn into a catastrophe. Fortunately, controllers at the airport could see that the landing gear had actually deployed, and they relayed that news to the aircraft. The plane landed. Everyone survived except one flight attendant who was sucked out of the aircraft by the airflow. The cause of the accident was metal fatigue and corrosion. Disaster 7. BAC 1-11, June 1990. You could almost call this story funny if it weren't for the shock experienced by the passengers and crew. A British airliner was flying from Birmingham to Malaga, Spain with 87 people on board. 13 minutes after takeoff, the cockpit windshield was blown out by the airstream and the captain was literally sucked into the opening. He got stuck like a cork in a bottle, half hanging out of a flying jet. What happened next was incredible. Crew members reacted in time and grabbed the captain by his legs, keeping him from being pulled out completely and helping prevent further depressurization. Obviously, surviving in those conditions seemed impossible, but if they had let go, his body could have struck critically important parts of the plane. The crew calmed the passengers and requested an emergency landing. For 25 minutes, the plane flew in this condition, with a flight attendant holding onto his ice-covered colleague the entire time. Immediately after landing, it turned out the captain still had a pulse. He was rushed to the hospital. The team not only landed the plane, but saved everyone on board, including the captain. The first officer, the flight attendant, and their colleagues became national heroes. Nearly all of them returned to civil aviation. The cause of the incident was a mechanic's negligence. When replacing the windshield, he took bolts of the wrong size from the warehouse. That's how one small detail nearly cost hundreds of lives. Disaster 6. Airbus A310, March 1994. Now one of the most horrifying chapters in the history of Russian civil aviation. Aeroflot was operating a flight from Moscow to Hong Kong. 4 hours into the flight, the aircraft disappeared from radar over the Kemerovo region. Air disasters are always terrible, but when the causes of this one were revealed, even experienced experts were in shock. The aircraft was in perfect condition. The weather was fine too. The problem was that mid-flight, the pilots let their children and friends into the cockpit. And they didn't just let them in, they let them take the controls. 39-year-old pilot Yaroslav Kudrinsky, violating every possible regulation, first put his daughter at the controls and then his son. The crew believed the plane was flying on autopilot, but the autopilot disconnected after a 15-year-old made sudden, forceful inputs on the control column. Worse still, the pilots took far too long to realize an emergency had developed. When they finally understood, they panicked and behaved in the most irrational way possible. Tumbling through the air, the airliner crashed into the ground. All 63 passengers and 12 crew members were killed. The subsequent investigation revealed a terrifying fact. If the pilots hadn't panicked and had allowed the automated systems to work according to their designed algorithms, the plane would have leveled out on its own and calmly continued the flight. Everyone would have survived. Disaster 5. DC-10, March 1974. Next, a disaster that was record-breaking for its time, claiming the lives of 346 people. The plane was flying the Istanbul-Paris-London route. Just 11 minutes after departing Paris, the airliner crashed. Shortly before that, a loud bang was heard inside the aircraft. 6 passengers in the rear row were instantly sucked through a hole that had formed and ejected outside. The crew managed to transmit to the ground. "The fuselage has blown out." Controllers noticed the plane's dot on the radar had split in two. Communications became garbled. The plane began plummeting. Everyone on board perished. So what was the cause? The rear cargo hold door. It sometimes didn't close fully, and this was a well-known problem for all airliners of this series. This hatch was always carefully inspected before takeoff, but this time, both the ground crew and the flight crew decided it was good enough. The price of that mistake turned out to be far too high. 346 lives were cut short because of one unchecked door. The name of that force is negligence. Disaster 4. Boeing 747, August 1985. Now let's talk about the deadliest single aircraft disaster in history. It happened in Japan, a country renowned for its meticulousness and professionalism. And this is an incredibly heartbreaking story. A JAL Boeing 747 was operating a short domestic flight from Tokyo to Osaka. The distance was only 500 kilometers, less than an hour of flight time, but it was a very popular route during the holidays, so they used a large aircraft. 12 minutes after takeoff, nearly all of the aircraft's key flight control systems failed, even the backup systems. The pilots couldn't understand what the problem was. With superhuman skill, they kept the plane in the air using only engine thrust and flap manipulation. The airliner was continuously tossed, dropped, and shaken. 32 minutes of that felt like pure hell for the passengers. If the pilots had known what had actually happened, they would have been even more terrified. The Boeing's entire tail stabilizer had been ripped clean off. The plane was doomed. It crashed into Mount Takamagahara, 112 kilometers from Tokyo. Some passengers miraculously survived the impact, but the rescue operation was organized terribly. Help arrived too late, and only 4 people could be saved. A total of 520 people died. The cause of the disaster was determined to be a careless repair of the tail section by ground crews that deviated from the proper instructions. Once again, people. Are you afraid of flying? What scares you the most, and how do you deal with it? Share in the comments. Your experience might help someone else. Disaster 3. Boeing 747, September 1983. One of the darkest tragedies in aviation history, one that still sparks debates and conspiracy theories to this day. A South Korean flight was traveling from New York to Seoul via Alaska. On board were 23 crew members and 246 passengers. The plane deviated from its course, entered restricted Soviet airspace, and was shot down by a Soviet Su-15 fighter jet. The airliner crashed into the La Perouse Strait. Everyone on board was killed. For many years, different versions of the incident contradicted one another. Only when all the investigation data was made public did it become clear that the case was not only tragic, but also disturbingly mundane. Relying on an incorrectly configured autopilot, the crew drifted 500 kilometers off course and had absolutely no idea they were flying over the restricted territory of a communist superpower. The pilots had been casually chatting about everyday affairs throughout the entire flight and hadn't even checked where they actually were. The Soviet Air Force, for its part, failed to properly identify the airliner and mistook it for a military reconnaissance aircraft. The incident triggered a severe political crisis at the height of the Cold War, which further undermined the already weakened Soviet leadership. It was the peak of the era of elderly leadership rotation, with Yuri Andropov serving as General Secretary. The tragedy claimed 269 lives and became a symbol of just how dangerous complacency in the sky can be. Disaster 2. Airbus A320, March 2015. A pilot committing suicide and taking everyone on board with him is not as rare as you might think. About a dozen such incidents have been recorded, with some claiming hundreds of lives, but this case is the most recent and the most definitively proven. A Germanwings plane was flying from Barcelona to Dusseldorf with 150 people on board. It was flying peacefully, like thousands of other planes in European skies every day. At 10 in the morning, the airliner departed Barcelona, and by 10:41 it had vanished from radar after a sudden descent. At first, terrorists were suspected. The wreckage was found in the Alps at an altitude of 1.5 kilometers above sea level. A lengthy investigation wasn't necessary. Decoding the flight data recorders provided an answer, but an unbelievable one. First Officer Andreas Lubitz waited for the moment the captain left the cockpit, then directed the plane toward the ground. On the recording, you can hear the captain trying to break back into the cockpit, but the locked door wouldn't budge. Lubitz remained silent the entire time, but he was alive and completely calm. He deliberately flew the plane into a mountain, killing everyone on board, including himself. 150 people died because a single mentally unstable individual had been cleared to operate a passenger airliner. After this disaster, psychological screening requirements for pilots were tightened worldwide. Disaster 1, March 27, 1977, Tenerife. And finally, the deadliest aviation disaster in all of history. We hope there will never be one worse. In the Canary Islands, terrorists detonated a bomb at Gran Canaria Airport. No one was seriously hurt, but the airport was closed. Dozens of aircraft were redirected to the small Los Rodeos airport on the island of Tenerife. Enormous Boeing 747s began packing in like sardines in a can. The airport was not designed for this kind of load. Someone was running late, someone had nowhere to park, and someone was having refueling problems. The air traffic controller, with a heavy Spanish accent, struggled to communicate with the crews. The two key players were a KLM flight with 248 people on board and a Pan American flight with 396 passengers. KLM could have waited, but the pilots were in a hurry. Their shift was ending. The airliner taxied onto the runway and waited for clearance. Pan Am was instructed to taxi down the same runway and position itself behind KLM. At that moment, a thick fog descended on the airport. Visibility dropped to 0. At 5:05, KLM received route instructions and interpreted them as takeoff clearance. But these were only preliminary instructions. As the controller said, "Stand by, I'll call you," Pan Am transmitted at the same time, indicating it was still on the runway. Because the signals overlapped, both messages became unintelligible. The KLM flight engineer sensed something was wrong, but he was ignored. One airliner was crawling along the runway in the fog. The other began its takeoff roll down the same runway. 14 seconds later, they met. At 700 meters before impact, they saw each other. KLM attempted to take off, but its landing gear and engines plowed into the American Boeing. KLM crashed, killing 248 people. From the Pan Am aircraft, 61 people managed to escape before the fire. 335 perished, a total of 583 victims. The debate over who was to blame went on for a very long time. A whole tangle of problems and fatal coincidences played a role. If even one misunderstanding hadn't happened, the disaster would never have occurred. In the end, primarily they blamed KLM and its deceased pilots. International radio communication rules were standardized and tightened to the maximum extent, so no accents or language barriers would compromise flight safety. Subscribe for more unbelievable aviation disasters, the kind most people never hear about and most airlines don't like to share. Today, you learned about 10 air disasters that made history. Some people survived against all odds. Others died because of a mistake that never should have happened. But each of these stories left a mark on aviation safety, forcing changes that still protect passengers today. Because in the sky, the margin for error is always smaller than it looks.